Okay, here we go. Presentation started. I'm going to be reading my notes down here, so my eyes are going to be mostly in front of my notes, but it will reflect what you see on screen. So, hello, everyone. I'm James Cheek. I'm an actor, writer, and ADR director with a lifelong passion for comics, and most recently, a contract writer at Crunchyroll, contract script adapter. Let's see. Hang on. Let me double check if my notes are all up in where I need them to be. And do. Okay. Awesome. All right. So here we go. All right. So yeah, back to it. James Cheek, actor, writer, director, blah, blah, blah. I have spent the last 15 years reading and learning about the form. I even got my BA in creative writing from UNT. With the intent of writing comics. And while my career has taken some surprising turns, comics are a deep passion for me, and I'm grateful to be able to talk to you all today about them. And yep, this is gonna be awkward. All right, here we go. All right. So these are the topics I'm going to cover today. If you have any questions, hopefully I'll have answered them by the end. And if not, that's what the Q&A section's for. Okay. So firstly, I want to give some context for today's workshop. Everything I'm going to cover is equally important, and there is no one way to get it done. There's a million different comics with a million different ways to make them. Also, the creative process is amorphous and weird for just about everybody. So you'll be working on these topics all at the same time. Character, world, and story are all interconnected, and as you work on one, so will another become more developed. I also want to go over some basics with you all so that we're all on the same page when I talk about stuff like gutters and panels and stuff like that. But before we get into that, I want to talk about comics. So the origin of comics goes back as far as the 1800s, but as a mass print media, or at least in America, they didn't start until the 1930s. Since then, they've had ups and downs in popularity and success, and in more recent years, they have flourished as new platforms have sprung up around them. But no matter when they're made or how they're read, they're all the same thing. A combination of art and words to create a unique narrative experience, regardless of aesthetic, culture, or country of origin. They are all the same thing. And so this is just a collage of comics that are important to me or were influential. And as you can see, there's a wide variety of style, layout, artistic, or aesthetic, and just approach and style. And so it doesn't matter what a comic looks like, really. It's just if it's a combination of pictures and words, essentially, it's a comic. So never let your perceived skill or lack of skill get in the way of making something. I say that having done that myself. All right, so let's get back to the basics. Here I'm going to cover the basic parts of a comic and what the job of a pilot or what a first issue is. Okay. All right, so there's a lot to a comic. Title panels are the opening credits of a comic. They can be simple or complex. If anyone has seen, I will have Will Eisner examples in this presentation, and if you've ever seen his stuff with the Spirit, you will know title panels can be really beautiful. But they also have the title of the book, the names and jobs of the creative team behind the comic. Panels are where the story takes place. This is where the art and the words come together. Borders are the outlines of panels. So some panels are fully enclosed, some don't have any borders at all. And a quick point, when I talk about panel design, I'm talking about the design of a panel's borders or lack thereof. So that's what that means. Gutters are the normally black space between panels. Webtoons have unique gutters, and I will be getting into that later, but for now we'll just move on. Columns are Columns and rows are how panels are arranged on a comic page. Bubbles and captions are what separate the dialogue and narrative prose of the comic. Captions are for prose and bubbles are for dialogue, both internal and external. Splash pages are big, epic art pieces and are usually saved for climactic moments of the story. They can have panels or be one massive painting. Page and panel design are how the panels are arranged on a comic page and are reflexive of the kind of story the comic is telling. And the real estate is an idea that I will get later into the workshop. I have a whole section on that. All right, so all right, and so this is just an example of the bare bones basics of what a comic book is. This is just a great reference to just, panels, captions, gutters, all that other fun stuff. So you just can see, see for anyone who just brain. So we're all on the same page. We can see what it is and know what we're talking about. Okay. So now that we at least know what I'm talking about when I refer to a gutter, we can talk about your first issue. So a pilot or first issue is a snapshot of your entire story. It introduces the reader to your characters, or at the very least your main character, the world the comic is going to take place in, and touches on what the audience should expect when reading it down the road. There's an idea in novel writing where the first page should contain or reflect the entirety of the novel. A pilot's job is basically the same thing, and to pull this off, you'll need to have a good grasp of, I got ahead of myself. To pull this off, you'll need to know your characters, world, story, and real estate you have to work with. If you have a good grasp of these 4 things, you'll know the most important pieces of your story and be able to integrate those into your plot. All right, so let's get into knowing your characters. All right. So here in this section, I'm going to cover what character development is, my approach to it, and some specifics you need to figure out for your characters. All right, so character development is the process of developing depth, motivations, and personality of your characters to make them feel three-dimensional. As a general rule, three-dimensional characters are what you should strive for, but not all stories need three-dimensional characters. A really great example is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes is a flat character with very little depth and never changes in any of the stories, but he is one of the most well-known literary characters to exist. So so the audiences tend to look for three-dimensional characters, but they don't always need one if your story doesn't require it. That's just an idea to have. There's a number of different ways to develop your character, and the one I use is called a crow. It's an improv tool for actors, but works well for fleshing out characters. Okay, so CROW is an acronym that stands for characteristics, relationships, objectives, and where. Characteristics are the physical and psychological parts of your character. They're the personality, quirks, flaws, just general design, etc. Relationships are how your character relates to the rest of your cast. So who are their enemies? Do they secretly love someone? Are they your hero or your villain? All that kind of stuff. Objectives are what the character wants. Figuring this out can be complicated because a character can have multiple objectives. And so I simplify things by categorizing them as macro and micro, and I'll get more into that later in the presentation. Where is where the character is coming from or their backstory. So it should contain everything important that has happened to them up until they're introduced to your story. Okay. And so here's an example of a filled out crow. This is an original character of mine. His name's Iggy, or Inigo, and he was developed for a comic that I was working on years ago called Ninja Pirate Monkeys. It's a swashbuckling high-sea fantasy adventure about a ninja pirate crew and their dangerously quirky captain. And so my face is covering a little bit of this. Let me see if I can move it around so you can see. Whoop. All right, there we go. There we are. So yeah, so we have just the basic, this is just basic information that I needed to communicate for me, so I knew all the different things that were about the character and that I could give to my artist who is a friend of mine, Sarah Forrester, who did the art for this. She did the art for all the characters from Ninja Fire Monkeys. And it was just enough. It was enough to get the job done, essentially. That's kind of the name of the game. If you want to do more, do more. But all you really need is just the main points to get the end result. So I'll just put that back because that's the most convenient place, and then I'll get back to my notes. Alrighty. Boop. Okay. So now let's talk about macro and micro objectives. So objectives are a character's wants or goals. A macro goal is a grand goal. They're what gets resolved at the end of a story along with the main conflict and are reflexive of that main conflict. They're ephemeral in nature, like wanting to feel seen or safe. They influence a character's micro goals, mainly what they are and how the character is going to go about achieving them, and are usually one per character. Micro goals can be Micro goals can be resolved during or at the end of a story. They can either be internal or external, but are mostly internal and are things like I missed notes. So micro goals can be resolved during or at the end of a story. They can be either internal or external and are mostly external, and are things like stopping a bomb or acing a test. These are the kinds of roadblocks that a character has to go through to get to an end of a story. They're usually directly apart or simply are the main conflict of a story, and a character can have many at one time. So that's the difference between a macro and a micro goal. All right, so as an example, I've quickly broken down a macro and some micro goals for Hades from Lore Olympus. So for the one person who has not read this, why have you not read this? But Lore Olympus is a rom-com inspired by the mythological romance of the Greek gods Hades and Persephone. And so here you can see that Hades' macro goal is in line with a standard rom-com hero. He just wants to be seen and loved. And that defines his whole life almost. And his micro goals are reflexive of his personality and setting in the story. They're about his job, they're about his day-to-day, they're about his family and relationships and things like that. So keep this in mind when you're giving your characters macro and micro goals. Also remember that a character's goals are what drive a story, and everything else is how they're going to achieve them. So their goals are just going to push your plot forward, and everything else, like their design and personality and backstory, are going to be how your character is going to try and obtain the goals they're trying to get. All right, and so now we're going to knowing your world. So in this section, I'll be going over your kind of story, the difference between a place and a setting, free versus fixed world building, and reminding you to keep focused on what's relevant. Okay, so the foundation of your world begins with your story. So what kind of story do you want to tell? A fantasy political drama? Well, that'll require kingdoms, systems of power, and a conflict big enough to involve all relevant parties. Are you writing a horror or a haunting story? Then you'll need to fathom some horrible tragedy and ground it to a place or an object, as well as tie it to a conflict the characters who are being haunted are currently dealing with. Going for a slice of life or grounded story, then you'll need to know the where and when of your story. Is it a real place, or is it some amalgam of other places, like your hometown plus this town over here plus this thing, interesting tidbit of this thing. And then are you writing a romance? Then how is your world keeping your two leads from getting together? These are the kinds of questions that influences the places and settings of your story, or questions that influence. All right, so Robert McKee, in his book Story, defines what a place and setting is in regards to world building. A place is a location and a period of time. A setting is a location in a period of time with some level of conflict for some duration of time. So like an example would be present day New York is a place. It is a location in a period of time. However, present day New York, currently under attack by the Sinister Six, is a setting for a Spider-Man story. There is a place, it's in a period of time, there is a conflict, and there's a duration for that conflict. Okay. There are two main approaches to figuring out the settings and places of your story, fixed and free design. Fixed design focuses on making the settings for your story and nothing else. So your fantasy drama, if your fantasy drama takes place in one city with a fixed design, you won't waste time fleshing out the world around it. Essentially, it's all about developing the details your story needs and only what it needs. Free design is the opposite. It's letting your imagination wander. You can do whatever you want. Want to work out the life cycle of a hypothetical alien plant? Then do it. Think of a cool natural wonder? Super. Think of an interesting take on a native tribe? Then workshop it and see where it goes. Free design is about coming up with ideas and places that stories can naturally come out of. Eventually, you will find a place where your story can happen and start transitioning your places into settings for your story to take place. Okay, so here's something to keep in mind. When building your world, it's easy to get sidetracked by the newest idea or interesting quirk you come up with. This can lead to world builder disease, which is a dramatic way of saying that you're stuck building a world and not writing a story. That's why it's important to know what kind of story you're trying to tell. So Lord of the Rings and A Song of Ice and Fire are both fantasy dramas. However, one in its pages gives us a map of the entire world, and the other gives us a map of a layout of a city. Why? Because one is an epic high fantasy adventure that is as much a morality play as it is an excuse for the author to talk about all the cool things he came up with. The world is massively important to that story. The other is a dark, low fantasy drama that's more concerned with the realities of living in a medieval world and character conflict. So the city, the place, and how it works is vastly important to that story, more so than knowing, where this mountain range is or where this forest is. All right, so now we're going to move on. So this is just to say essentially that you need to know your story. You need to know your story so you know what darlings to kill is essentially what I'm trying to say there. All right, so knowing your story. And boop, here we go. All right. So here I'll go over what a story is and some basic story structure, story plotting, and what a plotter and a pantser is. What it means to break your story, and different kinds of outlines you can use. I'll also touch on scripting and the ever-important question, why are you writing the story? Okay, so what is a story? It's an account of incidents, real or imaginary, often told for entertainment, and that's a simple definition, but it works. A common story structure is told in 3 acts. You'll see this often in TV, film, and almost any storytelling media. In general, each follows a basic formula. There are different kinds of structure, like 4 and 5 act stories, but the 3 act structure is so common that it's rare to find anything else. And as a quick point, like online comics, like web comics and things on WEBTOON tend to run for longer lengths of time than a traditional print comic does. And so even though print comics like Batman or something, may run for almost 100 years, they're typically broken up into like 5 or 6 issue arcs. So print comics tend to have 3 act structures. They work really well for that format. Long form stuff like web comics or stuff on WEBTOON can benefit from longer act story structures, like 4 or 5 act structures. But I'm going to focus on 3 act structures just because it's the easiest thing to do, and it's pretty straightforward. It's just got a bunch of moving parts. Okay. So here is a graph of a 3-act story. Along with the elements of each act, there are a lot of details that go into a 3-act story. And I will not blah, 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 blah. I'm just going to start over. Here we have a graph of a 3-act story, along with the elements of each act. There are a lot of details that go into a 3-act story, and I'm not going to touch on them in this workshop. If people have questions, I can answer them in the QA section. And since 3-act stories are so common, there's a ton of definitions and information readily available. The most important part I want you to remember for today is the inciting incident, which is the thing that kicks off your story. So for example, the inciting incident of Star Wars is the Death Star plans getting stolen. That's the thing, even though this happens off screen, that's the thing that gets R2-D2 and C-3PO to Tatooine. It's what connects them to Luke. It's, it's what helps, it's what puts them in the proximity for Luke to then discover Leia's message and then seek out Obi-Wan Kenobi. Like, the whole movie starts off because that happens. So that's your inciting incident. And the inciting incident is an important thing that will come up later in the workshop. Okay. So now that we have the structure figured out, let's work on the plot, or what's going to happen to your characters. So how do you develop the plot? If you are a meticulous person who likes to develop plans and strategy before you start to actually write the story, you are a plotter. Plotters figure out the who, what, where, and why of their story long before they sit down to write it all out, and will outline it before they start scripting. Pantsers are writers who prefer to fly by the seat of their pants, head first into the unknown. They start with an idea and just write, figuring out the rest as they go along. There are benefits and downsides to both. Plotters generally do more prep work. When they sit down and begin writing the script, they are more or less reformatting their notes. This means a lot of prep work before the fun starts. Pantsers eat their dessert before dinner. They get an idea and just run with it, which is admirable, but being a pantser can lead to blocks and abandoned drafts if too many problems show up. I personally am a mix of both. I like to have work done and figured out the world a bit, but eventually I get impatient and I just start writing. Okay, so now that you know your plot, it's time to make your outline, or break your story. Breaking a story is finding the beats or points of your story that match up to the structure that you're telling it in. So for example, your inciting incident, or when your main character crosses a threshold, are beats that you need to figure out in your story. For comics, this also means figuring out how these points break down into pages and panels. So you need to ask yourself, how many panels do you need to introduce your hero? How many for your inciting incident? Something to keep in mind as well, as a general rule, is that a panel can only have one action and one emotion. So if you have multiple characters in one panel all doing and reacting to something different, it's easy to confuse your reader. So just remember, when you're breaking things down to how many actions and emotions you have in order to get to the beats you need in order to fill your structure so that you get your whole cohesive story. There are multiple ways to break your story, like using a story spine or the Blake Snyder beat sheet, which is I believe that's in his book, Save the Cat. But how you break your story isn't necessarily important. It's finding your story beats is the main goal, is the important thing. Okay, so here is an example of an outline from a friend of mine. His name is Devin Kraft. He is a writer-artist that's been self-publishing his own books for years. However, his current book, which is the outline, is the outline that we're looking at right now, Never Ender, he was able to secure a publisher, and it will be releasing in comic shops this June. So if any Wednesday warriors are in the chat, just check that out. Ask for Never Ender. He does really great work. It's super fun. But this is a transcription of an outline of 6 pages from Never Ender, and you'll notice that it has some basic information on what's happening on each page with some specific beats and dialogue, but not much beyond that. And so, like your script, an outline can be as detailed as you or your creative team needs it to be. I think something I'm just going to harp on continuously is that you need to do enough to get the job done. Comics are kind of a unique medium in that even though it can be collaborative, there's not many hands that the parts have to go through for the end result to happen. So like film scripts are highly formatted because they have to be seen, in part because they have to be seen by a ton of different people, and so everybody has to understand what's going on. comic book scripts, often are just either one person or two people, or like you yourself, your letterer and editor, like at most it's like 6 or 7 people. And so if everybody kind of has an idea what's going on, then that's all you really need to do. Don't need to do any more work. So don't make it harder for yourself. Okay. All right. And so here are the finished pages of the outline that we had. So you can see how he broke up all the different sort of ideas and emotional beats of his outline into all these different things. And then we have these other 3. And so you can see the progression of ideas, and you get to see, this Neverender is about samurais fighting in space. It's really cool. I've only seen concept art from it, but I'm excited to pick it up this June. All right, so let's talk about scripting. So when it comes to scripting, there's no right way to go about doing it. It only needs to communicate enough to get the job done. There are 2 main approaches to scripting comics, full script and the Marvel method. Full script is the most common. It's a lot like a film script or a screenplay, but instead of stage direction, it will give the artist, or you if you're a solo creator, page layouts and panel descriptions, as well as dialogue and sound effects for each panel. Full script is the most common format because it's clear and gives the artist a starting point for drafting the layout of each page, among other things. The Marvel method is a rough breakdown of the entire issue. It might have some specific information, such as page or panel counts. It may have some specific dialogue in there, but it's mainly just the broad strokes of the story. The artist then drafts the whole comic, gives it back to the writer, then the writer goes back and writes the rest of the dialogue to fit the art. This method works and might be best for some. I know of one currently working professional writer, Matt Hawkins. He works for Top Cow. He writes in Marvel style, and that just works for him. However, it's a longer process for both the writer and especially the artist, because for a writer, you're basically writing the book twice, and an artist, you're just having to do a whole lot of groundwork for, laying out the whole story and pacing it. And so it's fast for a writer, and that's kind of the main draw of Marvel method. The reason why it's called Marvel method is because it was the method that Stan Lee used to write comics, I believe in the 70s, because he was writing so many books that he just didn't have time to do full script on anything. Okay. So this is an example of a script template. This was provided by another one of my friends, Emily Lord. This is the format she was taught at the Missouri State University, which has a 4-year sequential art program. So this is the script template that they are teaching at the collegiate level. And so it's got page number, panel 1, caption, and this is just this basic format. You just repeat it over and over again for each page. And then, here we go. All right, and then this is an example of a script, also provided by Emily Lord. It's about me and her dog Ridley, and Ridley hates me, and I'm not being hyperbolic about that. She is terrified whenever I enter a room, and we have spent the better part of a year trying to get her to not bark at me whenever she looks at me, and it's been a slow process. I can provide a link to the script and the template if anyone's interested, but I'll do that at the end of the I'll do that at the end of the workshop. But I'll just linger on here for a little bit so people can read. And then I actually haven't read this. I know it's funny because Emily is hilarious, but I have not read this yet. So at some point I will be reading it and probably giggle. But we have this, and then we have the last couple of pages. All right, and then we're moving on. Okay, so funnily enough, before we move on, I want to talk about why you're working on your story. So ask yourself, why this story? Out of all the infinite ideas you can come up with, why is this the one you're putting into the world? What about it is feeding you creatively? And yes, I know this is an artsy-fartsy question, but knowing the answer to it is incredibly helpful. It's also something that you might only figure out later on in the process of writing. Usually you can start off knowing why in the very beginning, but usually it comes into play after you've figured out some stuff, after you've kind of played in the space for a while. Knowing what excites and compels you to put your time and skill to make a particular story exist helps you know what to focus on. Mine what makes you happy for all it's worth so you don't get bored or burned out. This also frees you to be surprised by what you're working on. And this happened to me when I was developing Ninja Pirate Monkeys. Back many years ago, I had figured out a lot of individual pieces of the world and story I wanted to tell, but it wasn't coming together in a cohesive way, or coming together in a way that I wanted to. I just had cool pieces and I couldn't really figure out how to connect them. And so in re-examining, I realized that pretty much everything I had come up with was about having fun. It was an unhinged, just for me kind of fun. So I ran with it, and I came up with a whole mess of stuff that I thought was fun. And then after doing that, I realized a pattern was forming with my characters. They were all seeking adventure and fun because they were running from something. And so now the story became about escapism and nostalgia, and I finally felt like I had a cohesive theme. I knew what motivations to get my characters and what kind of conflicts to introduce and how everything should end. So when I figured out why I was writing the story, I finally knew what I was writing. All right, so now we're getting into real estate. All right, so next I'm going to cover what I mean by real estate. That word has come up a little bit here, and I'm going to finally define it. I'm also going to talk about the realities of telling your story in 60 or more panels, how someone reads a webtoon, and page and panel design. All right, so real estate is the space you have to tell your story. It's the page and panel count, layout, the design of your panels. It's the platform your comic is being read on, and the limitation and advantages that platform gives you. It's also how your readers interact with your story. So it's not just the content, it's not just the space to have your content, it's literally where your content is and what someone does or someone has to do to go and find it. So real estate's a pretty broad topic. So for context, the real estate of a print issue comic is a physical 32-page magazine with 22 pages of comic, 10 pages of ads, and it averages 5 panels per page. It will be read 2 pages at a time, because you're opening it up 2 pages at a time, with page and panel designs that have to fit a roughly 6.5 by 10.5 size page. And since print comic arcs normally run 6 or so issues, that gives the writer enough space to get through roughly halfway through each act of their story per issue. So a first issue is only going to get halfway through Act 1, which is roughly where the inciting incident happens. So the first issue of a print book has to at some point touch on or end at the very least, end at the inciting incident of your story. And because of the page count, they have 100 panels to do this in. The real estate of a webtoon is a narrow column of 4 to 60 plus panels stacked on top of each other. And with the call to action contest that's happening right now, you have a 60 panel minimum. So your pilot is going to have to do the same thing that a first issue in print comics does, with potentially less space to work with. So that is the challenge of publishing on webtoon, is that is part of the challenge at the very least is the format of webtoon. All right. So this is the physical space, the physical real estate that you have to work with for a print comic. This is roughly the same page size. The panel layouts, you can do whatever you want with the panel layout, but and panel design. But this is the confines of what you have with a print comic. Okay. Now there's a lot you can do with this space. You can do something simple and straightforward, or you can create a wildly beautiful and abstract double-page piece of art. These are the strengths that print comics have over webtoons. Like, you can't really do, like this picture right here on the right, which is I believe a double-page spread from the 2014 to 2015 Electra Solo series. You can't really do that on webtoon. It's too much vertical space, and it, the way that the way that the page flows from left to right, you just can't pull that off in a webtoon. But it is something you can do in a print comic, and so that's something to think about for print. All right. And then this is the space that you have when working on a webtoon. You have, this limited narrow column, and then you have all this space to stack your panels on top of. That's what you're working with. Okay. And while you can do, again, something really simple and straightforward of just sort of stacking things on top of each other, there is so much room for abstraction and panel design that you can't do in print. Now, this, unfortunately, I don't think is as effective seeing it like this, but this is a section of, I believe, chapter 3 of the Webtoon Brothers Bond. And the reason why I brought it up is because how it is constructed is that it starts off with a black space, and then as you're scrolling, it starts abstract color, and then it is slowly more and more defined, but you still don't know what's going on. But then you scroll to the very bottom of this section of the webtoon, and you come to your scene. That is an experience you cannot do in print. The medium does not allow you that level of control and to have that much detail moving in that direction, that the only way you can do it is on a webtoon. Okay. So with a print comic, a reader is looking at 2 pages at a time, which can be 10 plus panels of story, or like one big splash page. There's room for abstract page and panel design, but it's harder because there is so much space that it's easy for a reader to get lost and not know which panel to read first. And I think for people, I don't think this is a problem for people in chat, but for people who don't normally read comics, or longtime comic readers tend to forget that there is a language to comics, like just the visual understanding of things that that is learned over time. And so with print, because of just how much space is in there, if you get kind of weird with it, then it's easy to confuse someone who's not used to reading comics. The gutters in a print comic mainly serve as a buffer between panels. They can be used in storytelling, but really aren't. The panels are kind of the main draw of print. The pages themselves are static, with the only motion involved in reading a print comic is flipping from one page to another. And the panels normally read top down, left to right in an S or Z pattern. So it's this. That's how you interact with a print comic book. With a webtoon, a reader can only see 1 or 2 panels at a time, and they are arranged in a way that they're usually stacked in a narrow column. This format basically makes a webtoon one giant panel broken up by smaller panels. This makes gutters a huge part of the storytelling experience, because not only are they important for transitions between scenes and actual panels, but because they're a part of the giant panel, they can also be used to add additional ambiance and information to the reader. Like the example that I showed earlier with Brothers Bond, they can start off as blotches of color that will eventually lead into more constructed panels. There's also motion in a webtoon. Readers scroll down and scan left to right to get to the next panel. There is a literal motion that they have to do consistently to continue reading and getting more information from your comic. This gives you a metric ton of control over the information your reader will have at any moment. That is like that is the main thing. If I can differentiate, because I don't believe that webtoon is a different medium, or not medium. I don't believe that something on webtoon makes it inherently different from any other comic. I think that I think I said this earlier, but all comics are the same. It's just art and words together. But what makes a webtoon or something on webtoon so profoundly different from print is the platform's the control that the platform gives you over the information that the reader has. Okay. All right. So what does this mean for you? Well, it means get creative. Build your webtoon around how you know your reader will be interacting with it. Think about how your word balloons and captions affect the pace of your story. Construct your scenes around the scroll. Build to a twist by keeping it at the end of a panel. Think about how your gutters. Think about your gutters. What are they doing, and how can they enhance your story? The WEBTOON platform gives you a massive opportunity to make something totally unique to that space. So don't waste it. Like, it is so frustrating to see webtoons that are solid in every regard. Like, they are great stories, the art is great, the construction is wonderful, and they are just panel gutter, panel gutter, panel gutter, panel gutter. That is a massive waste of real estate for your story. You know, I mean, hell, you don't even have to put a gutter. You can just have like just one massive long painting. Here I have examples. This is a section from a Spirit comic. I think it's called like Mystery Fluid X or something like that. This is Will Eisner, the phenomenal Will Eisner. But this is something I was wanting to point out about panel design, is that this is a sequence of, I believe the Spirit is blind at this point and then is slowly regaining his sight. And so you can see how the panels themselves are adding to the reader's sort of emotional experience of feeling like they're blind and then slowly coming back to being able to see. And so that's the kind of things I'm trying to get you to think about when I'm saying panel design, and what you can do with panel design in WEBTOON. Like, there is so much room for abstraction that it is a waste if you don't do it. Alrighty, so this is some suggested reading for you to continue your education in writing comics. Some of these are out of print, others are a little old, like the Business Guide to Writing Comics. Which that actually is pretty out of date. I think that was published in like the 80s or 90s. But you know, so the information may be dated. However, personally, I found every one of these books to be helpful. You know, even Business Guide, because while maybe some of the specifics are a little bit outdated, there's still great information about structuring your story and just about the medium in general. Although because they're out of print, you're gonna have to hunt them down. So I recommend not using Amazon, but the internet. I'm also including some comic authors to check out. It's a mix of my favorites and people who I just know are good. You can read pretty much anything by these authors and learn something about the medium or storytelling. However, 2 quick points. First thing is that I'm including Gail Simone's Twitter handle because her Twitter is hilarious. She is galaxy brain, god tier level troll, and she's not mean, but God, is she funny. And I just think everyone should go follow her, because it is a delight when she pops up in my timeline. The second is I'm recommending Grant Morrison only because I know he has a masterful grasp of comics as a medium, but I personally do not like Grant Morrison. I don't like not him personally. I don't like his content. I don't like his comics. I don't like the stories he tells. I have yet to read a Grant Morrison book that I enjoyed. However, he has a level of understanding of comics as a medium that I do not see any other writer being able to replicate. So and as weird and maybe juvenile some of his ideas are, like, they can only exist in comics, and that's what makes him a valuable resource to learn from, is sort of learning the kind of unhingedness of what comics can do. Okay. All right, and then here are some things that I recommend that you guys check out. The writer Scott Snyder, who he wrote for Batman. He's done a bunch of stuff at DC. He wrote American Vampire. He has a Substack that is specifically for him teaching writing for comics. It does cost like $7 a month, which is, you know, like roughly the same subscription as like some streaming services, but you were getting a ton of information from one of the best writers currently working in comics right now. Donny Cates, one of my all-time favorite writers, also has a Substack where he occasionally talks about his process. I think he's getting into it a bit more. Donny Cates' Substack is free, if I remember correctly, because that's mostly about comics that he's making currently. He's sort of treating it like a label, like a publishing label, I think. So it's a lot of just newsletter stuff, but occasionally he gets into writing. These are YouTube channels that are great writing resources. I can personally say I learned most of what we covered in world building today from Tale Foundry. Film Courage focuses on film and television writing, but there's still some amazing stuff there. And lastly, here are some comics that I suggest you check out because they're just good and you should read them. They're just really good. Okay. So that is everything. So thanks for everyone who showed up. I'm just going to make myself big. Oop, there we go. And then now we've gotten to the Q&A section. And so now I am going to go scan the chat. Let's see if this will do what I want it to do. Yes, it will. Awesome. Okay. Let's see, is that going to be... No. Okay, I think I'm going to have to do this. Awesome. This is going to be fun. All right, let's... Whoop. So I'm just going to scroll through chat. I'm going to get some... And then I'm just going to see where... See questions and things like that. Let's see, WEBTOON's greetings. Actually, you know what? Instead of just doing that, you could just ask me questions now and I'll answer them. Just because it's the easiest thing to do instead of having to scroll through everything. But yeah. Oh, thank you. Yes, thank you. You are welcome, Lux, and you are welcome everyone who came in. This was crazy because I never really thought that I know a lot. I know a lot about comics because I've just sort of self-studied a lot about them, but I never thought I'd be in a position to talk about them in this way. So this was I had to dust off a lot of information to do this. Any suggestions on developing your drawing skills? That is a completely different discipline than writing. And the recommendation I have for you is life study. I mean, and just practice. Like art is a skill that is large. My understanding of it is that it's largely about repetition. And so just doing it over and over and over and over again is, with anything, but like art especially, because with writing there's theory, there's an academic approach to learning writing, and so there's information that you can go and gather before you sit down and start sit down and writing things. Actually, I'm gonna just take my glasses off because there's a glare, but no, I just look weird now. But anyway, but yeah, so there's just a different way of approaching more, and also like reading improves your writing as much as writing does, or not as much, but just it also adds to your skill as a writer. Art really you just kind of sit down and do. And that's all I have for that. I am not a artist. I'm not an artist, even though I did study art for a brief period of time in college. I am not an artist. Let's see, I came in late and don't know if you mentioned, do you have any general tips on finding an art style? Again, I am more of a writer than an artist, but my suggestion for that would be just write what or draw what you think looks good and what kind of feeds, like the happy button in your brain, like just sort of things that you want to see exist. And then as time will go on, eventually a style will form. Like that's more of like an effort plus time equals an art style kind of a thing. So don't be afraid to copy or emulate styles or artists that you see and like. But just as time goes on, eventually because part of a style is your taste as just a person. And so as you develop your skill and as you consume um, more kinds of art and different approaches to art and things like that, your taste will also change, and that will also help develop your own style. Any tips on best utilizing the space in a webtoon format like gutter space? Yes. Think about it as a giant panel. For your gutters are working, like your gutters are hugely important in a webtoon because because they just kind of they control the pacing of your story. Because if it's just a panel, white space, panel, white space, panel, white space, like it is kind of even if the story may be engaging, that's a boring way to consume it. And so I know, like I used Laura Olympus earlier as an example. I can't remember the author's name, but she just puts like little bits of color and splotches of things here and there to just break up the kind of the monotony, but also it's like reflexive of whatever emotion is going on. So you can use them to express abstract things in your story, and then sort of like the background is like an abstract expression of what the scene is doing, and then the panels are the literal thing that the scene is doing. um and also you don't have to have a gutter. You can just have one giant painting that flows from one scene to another in just one massive scroll. That is a Herculean task, but it is a thing that you can do. So that's some advice I have on gutters. How do I make every scene purposeful? Know what you're trying to do with each scene. So like when I was talking about breaking your story, like that's part of what you're figuring out. Or no, it's not part of that. Really is what you're figuring out when you're breaking a story. Is you're trying to figure out, okay, so I need this. I have this amount of space to, to introduce my hero or something like that. So this scene needs to do this, this, and this in order for the hero to appear. And I know this because my character, the hero, is this kind of character with this kind of objective, with this kind of a thing, and so to get him to do this thing, I need this stuff to happen. So it's the purpose of a scene in acting. The scene ends when the conflict is resolved in some way, and so so like two characters will keep talking or keep engaging until there's some sort of resolution to whatever tension that's happening in the moment. And so that's kind of something you have to think about when you're writing the scene, is like, okay, what is not necessarily the tension, but like what is the thing that is being dealt with in this moment, rather than just having an event happen. What is the thing that is inspiring the next action, which will then lead to the next point of my story, which will then lead to the next point of my story, which will then lead to the next point of my story. How do I avoid awkward dialogue and make it feel natural? Well, Lux, let me see if I can think of something more specific, because that's basically my job as a script adapter for Crunchyroll. It's just writing dialogue. Dialogue is sort of inherently unnatural. Like, people don't talk the way that characters do. It feels natural because it's true to the character. It's honest to their wants, their objectives, and their personality. And so awkward dialogue usually is when a character is being forced by the writer to say something that they themselves wouldn't naturally say. So, to avoid that, just try and, restrict your characters to, just kind of say, like, after you understand your character, their personality and their objectives and all this other stuff, just kind of limit what they can say to what they would say. And so if you're trying to get, character X to do an info dump, but that this character really isn't, built as an info dump character, then don't have him say it. Introduce another character to the scene, or just try and move it around, or he's the only one there, so he has to do it. Well, then put him in a situation where he would just sit down and explain all this stuff. That's my advice for that. Let's see, draw every day and try different things. Don't stay. Okay, cool. That's talking about art. Do you have any tips on making a good hook at the beginning of a comic? In medias res stuff is usually really good. Um, for hooks, uh, I mean, like there's a million different ways that you can do that. Like a a, a good hook is basically a really really brief snapshot of an interesting story. So, so a good hook would be just like if you can boil down your story to like an image or a or like a like one panel or something like that, or not, or like or not maybe like the story in its entirety, but like the theme that you're working with or something like that. Then then that would work as a good hook for your story. Like I'm gonna bring Lore Olympus up again. The book or the comic starts with a quote of like Hades confessing his love to Persephone, and that just is basically the entire story in a nutshell. And so it's this really pretty quote that then tells me, oh, okay, I know exactly what I'm going to get into, and I want to see how this plays out because this quote's really cool. And so that's stuff I recommend for hooks and things like that. Let's see, is there an entertaining way you've seen a webtoon paneling that print comics haven't been able to do? Yes, quite a bit. The best examples that I found have been in Brothers Bond that I referenced in the PowerPoint, but also the webtoon Darby does some amazing stuff with layout where like gutters are just panels, are just like lines of color, but they're color that's the same color palette as certain characters, so that you're like leading into a scene that is dealing with that character, or you're leaning into a moment that's focusing on that character. And sometimes there's just transitions where they're just it's just big slabs of color, that is really really interesting. Or there'll be like a dialogue conversation where it's just dialogue boxes with just abstract color and images behind it. Then as you're scrolling down and it kind of becomes more and more defined, that then sort of ends sort of at this climax of the scene. So you get all this sort of dialogue without context, and then eventually you get context for it, and it's a really fun experience. How to ruin writer's block? So there's a ton of different approaches to handling writer's block and things like that. Me personally, sometimes I just have to walk away. Um, writer's block for me comes in when there's something that my story needs to do that my characters, because of who they are, can't or won't do. Um, so so there's so then like I need them to go over to this side of the room, but the characters wouldn't go over to that side of the room, like for whatever reason, how they just kind of ended up being created. This character won't go do that, and so then you just have to rethink. What you have in order to get to the thing that you need to have happen. But I think writer's block is different for different people. I know there's often just sort of like an answer of just keep writing, like not necessarily writing what you're working on, but just write in general. Sometimes you just need to step away and not touch it for a while. And sometimes you just kind of need to be reminded about why you're interested in telling the story in the first place. But writer's block, from what I understand, is kind of like is a personal, it's different for each person. And so my approach to writer's block may be helpful to you, but I don't know if it'll be like a panacea or something. Will this video be saved for future reference? Yes, it will be. My problem is that I don't want to rush everything on the first episode, but I have way too much boring daily life going on in potential first episode. How do I reduce to the important and interesting stuff without making my webtoon seem superficial without depth? Needing to figure out for the action contest. Okay, so like I said before, the job of a pilot or a first episode is basically to give a snapshot of your entire story. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to tell your entire story in like 60 panels. It just means you need to know, it just means you need to know the important things. And so like usually stuff like theme, characters, setting have to be touched on. They don't have to go into depth. They just have to be introduced. And, as I mentioned before, in a 3-act structure, you really only have enough space to get to the inciting incident of your story. Now, webtoons, because webcomics in general, because they tend to run very long. They're like years and years and years at a time. Even though they're only published like a page at a time, they still will run for extended periods of time. And so there is a readership or readers of those things are a bit more forgiving, I feel, of slower paced stories and things like that. If you feel like there's a bunch of fluff in your first episode, then go back to, like if you haven't broken down your story, break it down. If you haven't outlined your plot, then outline it. Like just boil down the most important things that are to your story, and then look at what you have in your first episode and see what is introducing or serving those things, and what is just sort of, while maybe true for the life of the character, is not helping move anything forward. That's the thing about stories that are not, that make them unnatural, is that they're always moving towards something else. They're always moving towards the inevitable end of the story. Whereas, life, time always moves forward. Life can meander, and, you can have long stints of nothing happening in your life. Whereas a story, that just gets boring if that happens. I was thinking about an episode in the future of the story, but might confuse the reader. Okay, let's see. As someone who wants to start doing comics, what do you recommend as what I need to have? Do I need to be a freelancer, or have any document or legal stuff to actually make web comics? No. You just need you just need art and words, and a space to publish them. There's free spaces that may or may not get traffic, but there's free spaces out there where you can publish a webcomic. If you wanted to have your own like destination, like your own website or something, that would require building a website and owning a domain and domain and other things like that. Or I don't know about WEBTOON or WEBTOON Canvas's submission policy, so I don't know if it's an open thing where you can just, just sort of make your web comic, format it to the WEBTOON format and then publish it there. If you're wanting to get into legal things like copyright and all those other things, then you would need legal stuff and you would need legal counsel. And actually, the book, one of the books I recommended, Words for Pictures, has a segment in it that is just legal advice for writers. Now, granted, that is assuming that you're going to go into print, and it's assuming that you're going to, I think it's assuming that you're going to be writing like an independent print comic, but it's still really good information. I currently don't have the resources to do comic art myself, but I don't have any, I don't have a way to compensate artists. Any tips on how to get over this hurdle? Dude, same. That is a mood. It really just, it can depend on the artist. Like if you have a relationship with one of them, if you have a relationship with an artist and you ask for help to do this, then that may be a way to do it. There you can talk to someone and figure out maybe like a potential remuneration. Like they own half of the comic, and so if you end up making money off of it, they're entitled to half of it. Or you can talk about maybe like micropayments or something like that, just something that you can pay or can afford. But I mean, I personally, like one of the reasons why I have not done, have not like hardly published anything really, is because of that exact issue. Whereas like I'm poor, I can write a script, but I can't pay anyone to do the art. And Um, so like that is a very real struggle. And also, like comics are kind of punk rock in that it can, it doesn't matter what it looks like. It just got to have, words and pictures. So you can, you may not enjoy it, you may not like it, but you can draw something yourself. Now, granted, like the story you may want to tell may not work for the art that you're able to produce, but if you found a story that worked with what art that you could do and then started working on that, and then over time, maybe, like develop relationship with other artists or other creators or something, and then may eventually connect to someone who could do the art for the story you want to tell. That's one way of doing it. That is a roundabout way, but the point that I'm trying to make is that your skill as an artist um, doesn't get in the way of being able to create comics. Just so long as it has, words, pictures, and all the basic parts of a comic, you have a comic. Linda Berry, actually, I've referenced her a couple of times in the workshop. Linda Berry's style is pretty juvenile is not the word I want to say, but it's not highbrow art that she's doing. But her comics they're really good and they're really effective. Literary comics tend to just kind of like look however they want to look. And so if you want to get some examples of a more simplistic art style, I would suggest looking at some literary stuff, Linda Berry especially. Let's see. Are you going to post more content like this? I don't know. Honestly, my stream is mainly a video game stream right now. With the occasional like review. I'm currently reviewing a TV series that people who are fans of Heaven Official's Blessing also like. It's just sort of a way to see if people find it interesting or fun. Most of what I do is more like talking and being funny. It's not really educational like this. This was a lot of work to get this all together, and so I don't know. I don't know if this is something that I want to do. If it is something that enough people ask me to do, I may consider doing something else later down the line. If WEBTOON asks me to do something else again, I may do something down the line. But as of right now, this right now. This seems just to be a one-time thing. WEBTOONs is a self-publishing platform. Anyone can publish for free. Yes, thank you, Magnavara. And how to write good villains or antagonists. A good villain doesn't know that they're a villain. A good villain thinks that they are the hero of their story. So just give them very clear macro and micro objectives, and then just put them that are antithetical or antagonistic to your hero, and then just have them duke it out. That's really, that's a really simple answer, but some villains know that they're villains, and they tend to be like archetypes or parodies of villains. Like a compelling villain is someone who does not think that they are doing anything wrong or that they are justified in what they're doing. What are some good media to watch or reference? I reference some of that at the end of the workshop with stuff like Black Sad, which God, that's such a gorgeous book. Black Sad and Ancient Magus' Bride, and Lazarus, which is a book by Greg Rucka. God Country, which is a book by Donny Cates. Which, if you ever want to see West Texas look pretty, because it normally doesn't in real life, read that book. It is Donny Cates is a good old Texas boy, right down to his, like the cowboy boots in his soul, and that is just a love letter to Texas and Jack Kirby, and it's a wonderful thing. Also, as far as anime goes, anything that is written by, hang on, Keiko Nobumoto. She wrote Wolf's Rain, or she created Wolf's Rain, I think. But she wrote Cowboy Bebop and Samurai Champloo, and and just a lot of just phenomenal anime. But I'm drawn to her as a writer. Like she's she's a rare beast in writing anime, in that like her voice really comes through regardless of whatever she's writing, and even in the localization of the anime. So I recommend watching anything that she has written on. Also Genro Bochi is really good, and so anything that he's worked on is good. Although it will be just like nihilistic as all hell. Any suggestions on writing fight scenes for a web comic? Yes, a fight scene is still an emotional experience. It is not just punching. It is a conflict. It is, like the reason why there's like non-battle battle manga is because, fights are just conflict that are being resolved with fists rather than words. So think about the emotional stakes of the fight scene. Think about why your characters are fighting, and then and sort of structure the sort of highs and lows of your fight scenes around the emotion that's in there. And then so that's my recommendation for fight scenes. What would you rather fight? 100 horses the size of ducks, or 3 ducks the size of horses? 3 ducks the size of horses, because it's less things that I have to shoot. I mean, a bunch of 100 duck-sized horses would be hilarious. But if they're like strength proportioned, then maybe. But they'd still hurt if they kicked you. Like 3 ducks the size of horses, I would say. What do you suggest to go mainstream, or try go? Oh, sorry. What do you suggest? Go mainstream or try an indie approach with with a non-traditional story, or fill it with the most popular tropes. Do what tickles your brain. um like you can try and game the system in that way, in that you can try and do something that's popular, or you can or what you think is popular. The problem with something like that is that by the time that you have made the thing that you think is popular, the thing that is popular is no longer popular. Like if you see something, like say if like vampires came back in vogue or something like that, you're like, oh, I'm going to make a vampire story. By the time that you finish your vampire story, vampires aren't in vogue anymore, and the things that are survived or have survived are the things that were either like touched on something culturally that people got interested in, or made an interesting contribution to the mythos of vampires. So so just trying to do things that are popular is sort of hamstringing yourself, because eventually, because by the time that this thing is done, it's not going to be anymore. So what I suggest with something like that is just to do what you think is compelling, do what you think is interesting, and just kind of, and then from there just sort of see what happens, because you can't control what is popular or what is successful as much. You can do things to affect it, but that is more about like marketing and branding your comic, and like getting it into people, getting it in the eyes of in front of the eyes of people and stuff like that. Like that's more about the business of comic books than making a thing or making a comic. So I would just say, do what gets your, do what rustles your jimmies. How to give out information without info dumping? That is something where you just try and have it sound, try it come out as naturally as possible. Now the thing about stories is that they're just sort of like, they're inherently unnatural things. So with inherently unnatural things happening, so then you'll get stuff like the CW Arrowverse shows. While I love them, they do this all the time, where there's like, like fantasy action shows have to do this all the time too, because they have to like explain to the audience why this thing is dangerous. But they'll have like long, like 4 or 5 minute scenes where everyone is just like vomiting out information of things. But part of how they make it work or feel compelling is that they give, they give the information to the characters who would be giving that information in that moment. And so, so it comes out a bit more naturally or a bit more expectedly. With info dumping, you can also just there's also different ways that you can translate the information you want to tell to the audience. There's the visual way with comic books. If it's something that can be like acted in the art rather than being said, then just do it that way. Don't have someone say something. If it is something that you have to sit down and explain, then with a comic book, something that you can do is you can juxtapose the information with something that looks cool, so it doesn't feel as dull. Info dumping sometimes just has to happen. That's just kind of like the nature of storytelling, is that sometimes you just need to make sure the audience is where they need to be to understand the rest of it, and so sometimes you just need to with information, and so brain. So don't be afraid of having to do it. Just try and make the dump as engaging as possible. Let's see, my current project is already at 65 episodes, and it is very daunting, but I still want to tell my story and get to the good stuff. Any tip on how to get through my long story without losing my motivation? Find things that you can do or insert into the stage up until that point that you're looking forward to, that you find interesting or engaging. Like what you have to do to get to that point. So think about the most fun way of getting to there, to that point that you can. And that's sometimes you have to slog and just do it. But you can, but like I was saying earlier, is that like knowing why you're telling this particular story can help you figure out what to put into those moments to reinvigorate your interest. It's like, oh yeah, I wanted to do this because I really wanted to explore this certain family dynamic. Well, there's a really big climactic fight that's happening, but it's like 20 episodes down the line, and so right now I just have like 4 characters here. What can I do? Well, you can have you can introduce a character who sort of is it's sort of like a small allegory for some of the things that that your characters are dealing with, and just have them interact with him or them, or you can like pick a smaller fight between your characters and have that conflict be resolved or something. There are things that you can sort of pepper in between those moments that can make them more interesting. But that's my recommendation to you. About staying in character. Thank you. Go to fun stuff as a sneak peek, and then go rich. Let's see. How to make sure readers know what's going on plot-wise in the pilot episode when action and fight scenes are like the main priorities that are being judged. Well, that can be a reader being confused about like your issue, like your first issue or episode or pilot or something. That could be a number of different things. Like that can be what you're doing in your panels, and how that, like, maybe that's not the most important thing for your story. It could also be like just how you're laying out your your panels and for your webtoon. Like it can be just technical things. It could also be stuff in your story. It can be plot wise. For fight scenes, really, you just need to give a context of why people are fighting. Like you can start like a medias res in the middle of a fight, but eventually you have to tell someone why this is happening, or else there's no emotional stakes to it. So, so just, and especially with like an action oriented thing, like if you look at like battle manga is kind of a really good example to look at, where like the first chapter of a battle manga usually is just a massive like lore and info dump. Like they're not interesting, and usually the fight that happens at the end of a chapter 1 of battle manga is not satisfying. It's just a showcase of what the main character can do. So so for like the call to action contest, what I would recommend is that if this is a pilot that you're working on, like just really only have one fight scene in, but make the fight scene be the resolution to the to the big conflict that you open up with. and just give that fight scene emotional stakes. Give it a really strong reason for it to be there, and that will make it more compelling than just it looking cool. I have a story outline. How do I write it so each panel will engage the reader? Huh. I mean, that's a pretty broad question. Um, Mainly, it's just my recommendation to you is that if you have an outline, then you know the important things that you need to do to get from A to B to C. So just fill your panels with the important things that you need to get from A to B to C. Not every panel needs to be, you know, world altering. Not every moment needs to be lingered on. Not every action needs to have a whole lot of time and effort put into it describing it. Sometimes you just need someone to open a door, and that's all that you need in that panel and in that moment to get to the next part of the scene so you can get to the next part of the story. So don't necessarily think of it as every panel engaging the reader. Think of it as every panel doing their job to tell the story. And so some panels are going to carry more weight than others, but that's the whole experience of a comic book. Sometimes you just need a shot of someone drinking coffee. Do you think a one shot for this contest is better than leaving the pilot episode with an open ending? I personally, and this is just me personally, I have no affiliation with the judges, and I have not and I have not entered a kind of competition like this before, but my my idea would be is write a one shot that can be turned like that can be sort of taken to series almost, where you have a really good self-contained story with the characters and world that you're trying to tell. And if the pilot is successful, then write more and figure out more. Like think of it as like a pilot for television, where the job is to, introduce a world, introduce characters, and lay the groundwork for something else to happen. But sometimes, they just have, pilots have like good clean endings. And so you can have just like a solid one shot. And then if it takes off, then do more into it. But go into it having done the groundwork to be able to turn it into a series. Don't just make a really solid one shot and then retroactively try to do something. Like, do the groundwork first, so that if it is successful, then you can just run and start making stuff, rather than just sort of, spending a whole lot of time making one thing and then scrambling when it actually does what you want it to do. Someone told me for writer's block, just write a story anyway, and you can always go back and change it if you don't like it. That is an approach. That is a valid approach. What subreddits would you suggest? I'm not on Reddit at all, so I can't suggest anyone's. Oh, you're talking to someone else in chat. Never mind. Let's see. How do you get your comic to be noticed and read? You don't have a lot of control over that, unfortunately. What you have control over is the content itself. What you have control over is the quality of story, and is it, and how, are you satisfied with it? Are you happy with it? But you don't have control. There are things that you can do to influence your comic getting noticed and your comic getting read. Like if you have, like say this was a web comic and you had your own domain, you can put up ads on different other web comic websites, which was a thing for a while. There's like branding and advertising that you can do for a comic that can get eyes on it. But like ultimately, like the success of something is not guaranteed. You just kind of have to sort of sit and stumble away and trudge away and make the thing that you want to make. I mean, some things just, lie in obscurity for a long time until they're finally picked up by the right people, and then they, are finally seen and make rounds and stuff like that. So, if you are wanting to like advertise your comic more, then I would learn more about online advertising for your webcomic or something on Webtoon. But if you're trying to like make your if you're trying to like game an algorithm on a platform, like I don't know if Webtoon has an algorithm or not, but if you're trying to like like shine in that massive sea of very, very bright stars, because there's some really great stuff on Webtoon, like that's not something that you have a whole lot of control over. You just kind of have to just make the best thing that you can make. Best info dump character Hua Chang. I mean, yeah, that's his job. It's just be hot and know things. See, any suggestions on how to develop interesting side characters without them taking over the plot or outshining the main character? I mean, the goal of side characters isn't necessarily to have their own independent lives as much as they're there to enrich the story that everyone's involved in. Like a character that can take over their own story tends to get like their own spin-off. But like if you look at ensemble shows, or with like large cast shows with ensemble characters, you find that different characters serve different roles in the story. And so you just develop your character as best as they can, but know what their job is in the story. Know that this guy is, this guy's the tech guy who's going to be the one who's answering all these kinds of questions. This is the hero who's going to be the one that we focus on. This guy's going to be the best friend who his job is to, like assist the main character through emotional problems and things like that. And as you develop them more, you can add more to them. Tips for developing, but like side characters is they all have, every character has a job in a story. And so just sort of knowing what they're supposed to do and keeping them do that is, I think, is the way to go. Because if you treat everyone like a main character, then you're just going to have a bunch of people running off. You're going to have a bunch of people not interacting with each other. They're all going to be off doing their own things. Tips for developing foil characters. A foil for a character is just someone who is very similar, but just from a different perspective than what the main character has. Like villains tend to be foils for your main character because they are, they are like maybe they can be dark reflections or they have an antithetical thematic or psychological position than the main character. And so really what you want to do with a foil character is just explore in a different way the things that your main character is doing or meant to do. Like an anime, Vegeta is a really great foil because Goku wants to be the strongest in the world, or the strongest ever. That's his whole thing. That's the reason why the show exists, is because he wants to be the strongest. Vegeta also wants to be the strongest, but his reasons for doing that are about pride and this sense of superiority and this arrogance. Like his motivations are different than Goku's. Goku's is a bit more altruistic in that he just wants strength for strength's sake. He just, he's a martial artist. He just wants to test himself. And so those goals clash into each other when they're both trying to go for the same thing. So, just like a good foil would be like giving someone the same goal, but a different reason for going after that goal. And then you can explore the sort of the highs and lows and values of each perspective on how they're pursuing that same goal. I mean, that is a suggestion that I have for developing foil characters. Okay, we are now at an hour and a half. I have caught up to the bottom of chat. I think I'm going to call this workshop over. If that's cool with everyone in chat. So thanks to everyone who came by, who came in and checked it out. Good luck with those who are going into the call to action contest. Do I have any things I want to plug? I guess I'll also do it here. Watch Heaven Official's Blessing on the Funimation app, just because it's a good show, and I play sexy Chinese Satan. I have a podcast called Guys and Dolls where me and my younger brother are going through the entire Barbie movie catalog and watching and critiquing it. It is just a fun romp. It has nothing to do with comics or writing, even though we talk about those things in the podcast. I just recommend watching it because it's fun. My stream is I stream regularly as much as best I can on the weekends, Friday to Monday. It's Fridays are a continuation of the podcast with me and my brother currently going through Horizon Zero Dawn, and then during the weekend I review The Untamed, which is a live action Chinese drama based off of a different book series by the same author of Heaven Official's Blessing. And that's been fun, and so I've just been critiquing that, like reviewing and critiquing it. And then Sundays and Mondays, I'm currently doing a playthrough of Cyberpunk 2077, and that's been fun to do. I'm trying to build my character as best as I can around Hua Cheng. And so if you guys think I'm entertaining, come and check me out. Like I said, this channel is not really is not really built for like education stuff, but you can tell I am a massive nerd and I love stories and I love how stories work. So if you want to come in and ask me a question or just check it out, I am always here. I unfortunately can't talk about the things that I've worked on for Crunchyroll because they haven't been released yet. Or I would plug those things. Let's see. Awesome. All right. Well, I am going to call it a day. Again, thanks for everyone to come who came out. And again, good luck and Godspeed.